you wanna do?
Sitting with the crew, had to get some food. I see you looking like you do. Had to make a move.
Okay, so I don't really think the Joe Budden podcast is gonna make it past the next couple months. And if they do force it to last the next couple months, when it's renewed time, when it's going into 2022, I don't think we gonna see the Joe Budden podcast no more. At least the classic Joe Budden podcast with Joe Budden in the middle, Rory to his left, Maul to his right. When something is original and it's the first version of it, especially something like a TV show, a movie, a podcast, I don't really see how they can redo that cast and it still be successful. When Joe Budden started Everyday Struggle with Nadeska and DJ Academics, when Joe Budden left due to money contractual situations, Everyday Struggle went on for another year or two, but it was never the same. The numbers were never the same. As somebody who avidly watched the Joe Budden podcast all the time till about maybe 1 or 2 months ago, I ain't been watching it as much, but even the couple times that I still been watching it, I could already tell that there was a bit of tension there. I mean, there's always gonna be tension and disagreements when you're dealing with people who are not necessarily yes men. I used to see, even from way back, the little bit of fake tension, the jokey tension between Joe Budden and Rory. You know, several times they've played about fighting each other and challenging each other to fights. And you know, when you're a man, and this is not like a person who you grew up with, that's like literally your brother biologically, it's not too many times men are gonna challenge each other to a fight and just be joking. As recently as last week, I was watching the Joe Budden podcast, and the tension was so thick, it's like I couldn't even watch the whole episode. Like, the tension was so thick between Joe Budden and Rory, just Rory saying things Joe Budden didn't like, Joe Budden being cynical and half passive aggressive, but being direct at the same time, and to the point where Savon said it jokingly, y'all two just need to fight and get it over with. Pretty much they probably did, and they probably should if they have not. I mean, from my research on the Joe Budden podcast, because I've been listening and watching the Joe Budden podcast for a good 3-4 years consistently. There's been deals on the table that Joe Budden has not taken because he feel like he's worth more, but at the same time he's touched a certain level of money that Maul and Rory haven't touched yet. So being that it's the Joe Budden podcast, even though Joe Budden, I'm sure he spoke to them like, hey, listen, this is our shit. It's the Joe Budden podcast, but it's our shit. We're all equally important in this situation. But really what comes down to it is that paperwork, that real ownership, which Joe Budden preaches all the time. You know what I'm saying? That real paperwork and ownership means something, because from the research I've done, Joe and Rory been beefing about to fight, and Joe Budden basically told Rory to take some time off. Told him to take like a month off. Now, a month off is like over 10 episodes. And Maul, being part of that team, he felt the way that Joe Budden would just tell Rory to do that without discussing with the entire team. And that led to more being off the podcast currently. I tell you right now, Joe Budden is the name of that podcast, but Maul is the heart and soul of that podcast. He's the heart and soul of that podcast. You know what I'm saying? He has an unbiased, uncompromised opinion. And you could say the same thing about Rory, but Maul's presence as the overall real nigga, the cool nigga, the dude from the streets that was smart enough to not throw his life away, he's the heart and soul of that podcast. And if you take away Maul and Rory, that podcast will never be the same. It's never gonna have the same numbers. But men, if you watching this, I would like to say this is why when you join a conglomerate with other men, you always gotta have something of your own, because if you don't own that situation, if you don't gotta have equal ownership to that situation with somebody else, it's always gonna be somebody throwing shit over your head. It's always gonna be somebody throwing their weight around. Like, I've watched a couple times where I seen Joe Budden jokingly say to Maul, "Oh, Maul, you're fired," or "Maul's gonna get fired," or "Rory's gonna get fired." It's like, you're not supposed to do that. Like, you talking to other men. You don't play like that. I've watched Maul be like calm. A level of calm that I've been in situations where it's like you make that decision, like, I could wild out, but I'm not gonna wild out. I'ma just speak up for myself because I'm not, you know what I'm saying, like, I'm not a bitch. But it's like, clearly there's a power struggle, and Maul and Rory are aware of what they contribute to that podcast. And at the same time, it's money that they haven't seen that they probably should have been had, you know what I'm saying? Like, Spotify probably offered them a $20 million contract. But if Joe feel like it's worth $50 million, he gonna hold out. And because it's the Joe Budden podcast, which he meant to put Joe Budden podcast so he could throw his weight around. Like, if he really wanted it to be more equal rights for Maul and Rory, it'd have been the Joe Budden podcast with Rory and Maul. And it would be in the title, you know what I'm saying? There's not going to be another podcast like the Joe Budden podcast as far as talking about pop culture and talking about rap music. There's going to be more to come. There's going to be more successful ones in the future, probably. But the Joe Budden podcast started it all. In a perfect world, they would get past all their differences and come back to normal, and it'd be like it used to be 2-3 years ago. But probably not. With Maul clearly wanting to be a boss, with Rory clearly wanting to be a boss, and Joe Budden not willing to leverage no power, I see within the next 12 months, these guys are going to go their separate ways. Unless the Joe Budden podcast gets offered a huge deal that they agree to put all their differences aside for, man. But let's wish all these guys the best in their families. Peace.